our next speaker is Gautam Bhatia. He is an Indian speculative fiction writer, reviewer, and editor, based in New Delhi, India. He is the author of the SF duology, The Wall 2020 and The Horizon 2021, published by the HarperCollins India. Both books were Locus Magazine's annual recommended reading list and earned critical praise in Locus, Interzone, Vector, and in mainstream Indian newspaper. We welcome you, sir. Please give them a big round of applause.
The subject that we're talking about is the sentence, which is quite obviously pegged on Gautam's book by the same name. Gautam Bhatia, apart from being a very significant legal scholar and constitutional scholar, is also a speculative fiction author with a remarkable body of work. How he finds time to do that is beyond me. Now my first question would be obviously to Gautam. Since we're talking about speculative fiction and its abbreviation SF, one straight away thinks of science fiction. Could you draw the line where the speculative part of it begins and the science fiction, and what distinguishes the two?
Yeah, thanks, Vinayak. I think that's a really good question to start with, because historically you had fantasy and science fiction, and these were thought to be two different genres doing two very different things. So fantasy is your Lord of the Rings, more recently Brandon Sanderson, swords, wizards, magic, all of that. That's fantasy. I'm being reductive, but that's the basic idea. Science fiction is Asimov, Arthur Clarke, and so on. Spaceships, far future speculation, engineering, physics, and so on. But then there was this branch of writing that was not really fantasy, in the sense that it was involved in world building, in the sense that it engaged with the sciences, but not the physical sciences, more the social sciences. Alternative worlds, other kinds of social organizations, anarchist societies, and so on. And so to try and capture the range of writing that would not bring up images of spaceships or swords and magic, there was this more inclusive term of speculative fiction, which involves speculating about societies, future, and so on, but need not be reducible to just the physical sciences or to fantasy. So it's a more encompassing term than either fantasy and science fiction. Nowadays you either have SFF, which is science fiction fantasy, or SF, which is speculative fiction, and that's essentially the root of this division.
So we're talking more Orwell than we're talking about what you would call Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah, Orwell's a good example of something that you would now call speculative fiction. Yeah, it's more, Orwell is dystopia, but dystopia is a branch of speculative fiction. Yeah.
Perfect. Picking up from we spoke of the distinction between the speculative fiction and all the different kinds of fiction, like science fiction, fantasy fiction. So moving on from that and sort of drawing from that line of thought, I would go to Sunita Bansal, ma'am, because wouldn't mythology be the OG of the fantasy and the fiction overall, and science fiction in total? Because our journey as a human being of creating fiction as a society, didn't that come out from mythology?
I don't think that could be called as a source, but yes, mythology is so interesting that you can create a lot of stuff. So you can speculate a lot, as you can say, you can fantasize. So these days that it's becoming popular because there is a connect. People relate to mythology because it's extremely relatable, and people are aware of certain mythological characters, so it's easier. So I guess that is why it's being used more in the sense of creating fiction. Like in my case, I use mythology as well, in this book of mine. But I wouldn't say that's the original source. No, I wouldn't say though.
Coming back to Gautam, do you believe that there is a common ground between the mythological and the speculative? Especially in context of the kind of writing that you do.
Yeah, there's certainly a common ground, and I think common ground is in one or two ways, right? So one is that I think as Indians, growing up as Indians, mythology is a central part of just our existence, right? Almost by osmosis, you know the major events of the Ramayana, of the Mahabharata. You just know it. You've heard it from your grandparents. You've seen it on TV. So and they always percolate, down to you. And in that sense, it's inevitable to be influenced by those events, when you're writing. And in fact, some of those stories, for example, in Indian myths, have the same roots as, say, the Greek myths, but are actually more complex in some ways and more interesting. And it, of course, goes both ways. And so I'll give you an example, and not in this book, but in my previous duology, I remember using one of the, Ramayana myths, Jatayu's elder brother, and his wings were burnt when he flew too close to the sun to protect the younger brother, right? And of course, you have the Icarus myth in Greek mythology, right? So you can see a common root. And in that sense, when you're writing speculative fiction, this is a very rich storehouse of materials to just draw from. So I think all of us, when writing SF, in some ways, you may see it in a submerged way, in an undercurrent. It may not be dominant as it is in, more explicit mythological fiction, but it's always there just because these are stories they've grown upon and we can't really abandon them.
All of these conversations that we've had just now, they've centered on the existing. Now, a significant part of speculative fiction, the kind of fiction that you write and the kind of fiction that the sentence is based in a fictional world. So that requires, a massive part of that requires of building a world or world building. How do you as an author embark on the journey of building a world?
Central to both fantasy and science fiction and speculative fiction is world building, because you have to construct an alternative world. And I think one of the things that attracts me to SF is that you can basically experiment in different ways in that world, right? So you can ask yourself, well, what if there's this one thing which was different from our world, which we take for granted? How would that world look in which you just change this one thing? So for example, in this novel, the premise is that they've managed to artificially preserve the human body in a very cold environment, and you can be revived many years later. So instead of having a death penalty, they have a reversible death sentence where instead of being executed, you are frozen in time. And if many years later there is proof of your innocence, you can be revived and live again. What would that do to ideas of justice, of retribution, of punishment, all of that? So I think like the really great thing about this genre is that you can ask these questions and you can have a world that looks like our world, resembles our world, but is just slightly different in some ways. One more very famous example, one of my favorite stories is by Isaac Asimov called Nightfall. And in that story, the premise is that you have a planet and you have 6 suns around it. Not just one sun, 6 suns. So there is never nightfall, except once in 2,000 years when all the suns are on the other hemisphere. So you have generations upon generations who have never seen nightfall. And then there's this one generation that sees the stars for the first time in human memory. How will they react, right? So what if something as basic as the night was not there in this world? What would that world look like? So I think these are the questions that world building really, you can play around with it so much and do so much with it.
When embarking upon creating a world in this way, how do your opinions as an academic and as a lawyer and your entire legal philosophy, because you have a significant body of work on that sphere of your life as well, how does that inform your world that you've created and the way people behave and the governments behave and every character in that story behaves?
Well, so it's a bit like if you're a physicist, right, and you're talking about a spaceship in your science fiction novel, you'll make sure that the spaceship has all the right, parameters, right? So you'll use your expertise to do that. Similarly, if you're a lawyer, you've seen how law works as sort of almost the hidden plumbing of the world. And so you know that these legal structures underlie political structures. Once you know it, you can't unsee that. So in your work then, by virtue of your profession, it will just come in naturally, right? So you will pay attention to constitutions, to laws and so on, and it'll just be there, much like a physicist, in the spaceship, right? So it'll just be accurate in that way.
In fact, before you add on to that, I have a question for you, drawing on the same world building exercise. How much leeway and how much scope of world building does a mythologist like you have while, building on her body of work or writing it?
Well, I don't really write mythological fiction as such, but in this particular book that I'd like to talk about, which also concerns law, The Return of Vikram and Betal, Here, what I've done is I have drawn on the myth of Vikram and Betal. So I've only used the philosophy of Vikram and Betal about how Betal gives Vikram stories, tells Vikram stories, and kind of gives him riddles to solve. So I've just used that, and then I've built upon it, and then I have taken real criminal cases, and that's where the law part comes. So I had to be extremely careful to get the real criminal cases, the right cases, and also the right verdicts, because it's not just good enough to take a case, the verdict. So I had to then I had to create a world of those criminals. For instance, if there's a case of, say, Pontichadda that I've taken, so I've got the case and I've got the verdict. Now what happens? So what I have created is a world of Pontichadda, which is absolutely fictional. I mean, I obviously, don't know these people, so I built that world, bringing them to a point where the crime happened, and then the whole case follows. So that's what I've done, and then the Vikram Betal, the myth of Vikram Betal walks into the picture, and then Vikram is the guy who's giving judgment, and Betal is the fantasy element, because he's a doot and he kind of comes. And there I brought in the mythology of how how the soul is, because if I just talk about Betal just like that, it's not going to make sense. So I make that soul come into different bodies at different times, because a soul does not die, it changes bodies. So you see, that is how I kind of created this whole scenario. So that's how I built the world. It's pretty much built on mythology, as well as I take on the reality and then create a world. That's the fun part of writing.
Since mythology also becomes very contentious, considering how it has different perspectives. In the case of 99 Ramayanas and all the different kinds of Mahabharat versions that are around, how do your opinions shape the interpretations of the various mythologies and the mythological sources that you draw from?
I do not like to give my opinion, because I think I should essentially present as what it is. So I just present the thing as it is for people to make their own opinions, because I do not want to impose my opinion on my readers. I would rather that they have an opinion and then have a conversation with me if they do not like something. Many times it happens. So I invite dialogue. I do not like to impose my opinions. I just try to lay it bare as it is.
Now, coming to the next stage of our conversation here, what would you call your most basic inspiration for writing this novel?
I mean, so there are actually many inspirations, and it's difficult to sum them up in one or two. In fact, I'll try. In fact, what I do is at the end of my novels, I always have a little section which is basically acknowledging my inspirations for that novel. It includes books, includes historical events, includes other things. So for this, there are a few. One is a very famous novel by this novelist called Ursula Le Guin, called The Dispossessed, which was published in 1969. It's one of the iconic speculative fiction novels in history. It's one of those things you're going to have to read if you're into the genre. And its premise is basically you have a world, a planet, in which the economic system broadly resembles our economic system, broadly capitalistic, and its satellite moon, where a bunch of exiles have basically built what is in effect an anarchist society. So they live by the rules of anarchism, and they have managed to create a sustaining society in that way. And there's constant tension between the two, obviously, because you have two very different economic models. And this is a novel that really looks deep into questions of political economy, of equality, of justice, and so on. And it's become famous as a very serious treatment of all these themes. One of the inspirations is this, because in my novel you have two parts of the same city across the river, and they follow very different economic models. The second is a historical event, which is the Paris Commune, which was 1871, where the Parisians basically rebelled and formed their own democratic commune where they ran their own systems. It lasted for about 2 months, and then, of course, the French army came and effectively militarily suppressed it, and there was lots of bloodshed. But one of history's enduring questions is that had the Paris Commune survived, what might have happened, what might have been. And one of the great things about SF is you can ask those questions and answer them. Okay, this is what might have been. Right? So yeah, these two are two of the main inspirations behind this novel. And there are many more which I talk about at the end of the story.
In case of Sunita ma'am, that question becomes moot because inspirations, I mean, I would still ask that question, but
You must, because I
yes.
want to answer that question.
yes, what are those inspirations beyond the obvious that we look at, the Mahabharata, and which have been obviously quite overused with different works coming out, different versions, different interpretations of them coming out and becoming wildly popular, right? Especially in the background of the Yugo Ramayana still, holding the place that it does in popular imagination of our generation.
So inspiration for this was nothing to do with Ramayana or Mahabharata. The inspiration for this was the original Betal Pachisi, which is like 25 stories of the Sprite, as they call it, the original edition. I have that edition with me, and when I was reading it, it was fascinating in the sense that, okay, it was written like hundreds of years ago, but it was boring in the sense that if you read it now, you won't really enjoy the stories as much because there's no kind of masala in it, So I wanted to simplify and reinterpret those stories. So I tried working on that first. So I tried to write the same stories of the original Betal Pachisi in today's scenario, and I realized that it was boring any which way, whatever you may do. And that was the time when I felt that why am I looking at the stories? Why am I not looking at the characters and the emotions? Why am I reading this book at all? Look at what is happening. This is happening all around us, the emotions, the relationships and so on, how they break down, how they build up and all kinds of stuff. That's when I decided to leave Betal Pachisi aside and get down to finding stories, real emotional related stories. That's when I decided to start working on a newer way of reinterpreting Betal Pachisi. And that's when I watched this movie, Rustam. Okay. Now, that became my inspiration because when I was watching that movie, Rustam, my mother commented that, "Arey, ye humne dekhi thi hamare zamane mein, black and white mein, this, that and the other." And she knew the story of Nanavati, the case of Nanavati. So that's what made me realize that certain cases have, that kind of value that people remember. They get stuck to the memory. So that's when I started digging around for criminal cases, including even that Nanavati case, and created this whole scenario and wrote this book. So my inspiration was the original Betal Pachisi and Rustam.
Speculative fiction is still a very niche genre. Speculative fiction is only in the popular imagination at this point, is only limited to The Brave New World and 1984, and more recently with the Divergent series and the Mockingjay series. If someone wants to dabble into the pure speculative fiction, in your opinion, what is the approach they should take, and what would be your reading list for someone just beginning to read or just getting into the speculative fiction genre?
Yeah, so just I think one small point, Divergent and Hunger Games are both more YA, young adult, than spec fic. But these are all labels. I mean, they're of course speculative in character. So, but to answer your question, so one is I have a list on scroll.in, which I made 2 or 3 months ago. It's basically 15 novels for people who want to get into the genre, but I've always been a little hesitant about it. So because they've been told it's either swords or spaceships, right? So yeah, so basically SF beyond that. So that list you can take a look at it. A couple of novels I'd say, well, I'd first say non-Indian and then Indian. So if you're interested in Indian SF, so non-Indian, among the recent ones, I would recommend this fantastic book called The Mountain and the Sea, which is by this author called Ray Naylor. And the premise there is that you have this race of sentient, intelligent octopi that have basically evolved very quickly because of environmental changes. It is first contact between human beings and intelligent octopi. And it has many of the classic science fiction themes of language, of translation between two species, of just like, this idea of when you first meet an alien species, what happens, all of that. but in a very modern sensibility, a very modern writing style. So very quick, like, it's very good. And, the author has done a lot of work in imagining that if octopi could speak, what might language look like? Because they have a language of color, right? So their skin changes color to communicate. So he takes that, to the next level. So it's a really fascinating exploration of, I think it's where modern science fiction spec-fic is at the cutting edge. That's one recommendation. The second is this book series by R.K.D. Martin called Memory Called Empire, which is, again, it's in a certain sense in conversation with Isaac Asimov's famous Foundation series. But again, it's much more modern, written much better. The old books are a little more, like the writing style is a little more dense. It's a great exploration of science fiction in space, space opera, exploring new worlds, things like that. So I think these are two I would recommend to start off with. They're not difficult reads, they're fairly accessible. In India, recently there's been an upsurge of writing of this kind. So for example, you have Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan's book Analog Virtual, which was republished as The 10% Thief in the UK and was a Clark Award finalist this year. But in India, it's called Analog Virtual. Near Future Bangalore, Dystopian Bangalore, Analogs, Virtuals, 2 classes. So that's a good start to get into the genre.
So someone looking to get into mythological fiction, what would you recommend to them first out of the bat on the genre of mythological fiction, not the original source? And secondly, going into the original sources, what would you say would be the top 5 reads if someone young is going to pure mythological sources that you've gone into?
That's the most difficult question to answer because I normally don't talk about other writers or other writers' books.
Fair enough.
So kind of trying to catch me there. But one thing I can say that amongst all the mythological fictions that I've seen, read, I've always preferred Ashwin Sanghi's work because the amount of research that goes into it and the kind of world he creates using mythology as a background is something I've always admired. And then I'm told he has a phenomenal team that helps him to do that research. So yeah, that's the only name I'd like to mention. As far as other mythological stuff is concerned, there is nothing, it's like any book that appeals to you, you pick up and read. Authors don't matter, it's the subject that matters. If you want to read about, say, Ramayana, you can pick up anybody's Ramayana. As long as you pick it up, you start reading it, you'll probably pick up more versions, probably you'll pick up more writers. So writers don't matter really in mythology. That's what I feel. That's the reason I don't give the names of any writers.
Fair enough. Now, Gautam, how does the criminologist in you, because there's a significant underlying criminological theme of death penalty, right? You've dealt with that in your book quite, and you've explored that theme quite a bit and gone really creative with it. How does the criminologist in you read and write and deal with these themes?
Yeah, so because once you've been trained in law, you are very familiar with the arguments, and death penalty is something that is never purely a legal issue, right? It's always a moral, ethical issue. It deals with the fundamental questions about the criminal justice system. Is the goal retribution? Is it deterrence? Is it prevention? Can human beings claim infallibility in judging somebody else to the extent that you have an irreversible punishment that you offer up? To what extent can you ever be certain that someone is guilty to, inflict the certainty of death as a punishment? So all of those questions, are in your mind. And the attempt is to use fiction as a way to explore them in a way that's non-didactic, right? So you're not trying to shove a perspective down the reader's throat. So if you're an abolitionist or if you're pro-death penalty, the point is not to try and teach the reader, right? This is the correct perspective. But to use fiction to lay out what the problems are and what the arguments are, and then let the reader make up their mind where they stand, right? So I think that the challenge is to really, at the end, and I think a good SF novel is one where at the end, the reader is not really sure which side they're on, right? And they have to think a little bit to ask themselves, okay, which side am I really on? And that's, I think, the success. I think that's success in an SF novel, right? You create the ambiguity there, and criminology is a ripe and fertile ground for creating all these ambiguities and these ideas of what is the right thing to do. Because ultimately, the book is a question about what is the right thing to do in a given case.
This is the exact theme, because the protagonist was a criminal lawyer first before he became Justice Vikram. So I think, I would say it required me a great deal of effort to understand law and to understand, how judgment was reached, how a verdict was reached. So I had to talk to my criminal lawyer friends to take their help to see, to understand how mind of a judge works. What are the various factors, that get involved into, again, as he said, what is right, what is not right, and there's no black and white. It's a question of perception, understanding of the judge at that point. So, but in my case, he has left it to the readers. But in my case, because the judgment was already there, I could not leave it to the readers. So I kind of worked on it and created a fictional narrative. I had to do a lot more studying of law, which was kind of tough, coming from my background.
This is where we come to the final part of our conversation today here. I know from our conversation that you do not want to, read out a passage from your book. So instead, I will ask you, if I am reading your book, if I am reading The Return of Bikram and Betal, which would be your favorite case, basically, from all the cases that you've dealt with here?
You see, in this book, it is not just a collection of cases, first of all. So I cannot say that, okay, this is my favorite case, so you read this. This is the protagonist's journey. So as he's going through the cases and giving, reaching verdicts, what is happening is his life is also changing. So he is taking something in when he's passing a judgment. So you cannot actually, in the middle of the book, pick up a case and say, okay, I'll read about this case because this is interesting. It cannot be. So you have to read my book right from page 1 till the end, because that's how you will actually understand what happened to the protagonist and how he changed and how all these judgments, all the judgments that he passed, what, they did to him, to his life, and how they helped him resolve his own personal problems, and how, those cases get related somehow to his own personal life. So that was an effort that I had to put in terms of creating a world for him where I could relate these cases, the real ones, with his fictional life, with his life that I have created, and how he's resolving his own issues. So you really have to read the complete book, Vinayak, you can't get away reading just one chapter.
Well, that's a fantastic call of action straight from the author's mouth. We here at ALF have the immense privilege of having the advanced copy of the sentence. So while everyone waits for their copies at home, would you like to read a passage from the book?
Sure, I'll do a brief one, which is at the combination of law and the science fiction part of this.
Absolutely.
So the premise of this novel is, like I said, that they've invented a way to preserve the human body in cryo sleep, and so the death penalty is been replaced by this reversible death penalty, and there is an individual who was sentenced to this reversible death penalty for a political assassination, and 100 years after, there is some evidence that he might have been innocent. So the action takes place around this 1 week where they have to either save him or he will be permanently unplugged and will die. So that's the action in the novel. And towards the beginning, the protagonist is just looking up the history of death penalty in their city, and they come across the court cases where this was debated, and they come across the judgment where the death penalty was reinstated because it was now reversible, and in that they find the dissenting judgment in that case. So I briefly excerpt that, and so this is at the combination of the intersection of the law and the science fiction. So I'll just read out that. It's a couple of pages, and then we can stop there. Some of the terms, of course, the city is called Peruma, so that term you'll understand when it comes. So I'll just start. So this is all the beginning of chapter 2 of the book, of part 2, and this is all excerpt from a historical judgment within that fictional world. 25 years ago, the Directorate Court abolished the death penalty. Our decision was celebrated not only in this city, but across the subcontinent. What Peruma thinks today, the subcontinent thinks tomorrow. In our wake, city after city removed this vestige of barbarism from their own laws. Today, this court has decided to consign its own legacy to a sleep of death. In a way, it was a chronicle foretold. This court's ruling from 25 years ago was based on a single premise, that death penalty assumes infallibility. Infallibility of knowledge, of truth, of judgment. We are human, we make mistakes, yet the death penalty does not allow us to atone for error, because you cannot bring an innocent person back to life. Writing separately, the wise Judge Ilarun warned against this reasoning. The claim to infallibility was just one of the many reasons why death penalty had to go. But to base judgment only upon that was to build a castle upon a foundation of smoke. Perhaps Judge Ilarun saw the future. In her time, there was no indication that cryogenic preservation research would advance so far that within 25 years, it would go from a futuristic dream to workable technology. And unfortunately, it has also given this court a chance to resile from its historic decision. Today's court appears to argue thus: cryogenic preservation has turned death penalty from an irreversible punishment to a reversible one. This has dissolved the only distinction that existed between the death penalty and any other form of punishment. We can at last atone for human error. If we find out that we made a mistake, we can just wake the sleeper up. Let me take this argument on its own terms. There may have been a case to answer had the sleep of death ironically itself been permanent. But it is not. Our science only allows for preservation up to 100 years. After that, the body breaks down. Death must come. The court attempts to escape this bind by seeking refuge in mathematics. It takes the mathematical concept of the limit, x can approach y, such that x is never equal to y, but the difference between them grows so vanishingly small that for certain purposes, you might as well take x to be y. Then the court says that while the possibility of an error can never be zero, with time it grows smaller and smaller towards zero. And when 100 years have passed, for all practical purposes, the probability of error has become zero. The court uses these fictions to exempt itself from the burden of infallibility. Evidence erodes, witnesses die, memories senesce. The fault is not with the truth, it is with our ability to discover it, flawed from the first to the last. That's why I believe that this new technology solves nothing. By allowing this so-called sleep of death, the court readmits brutality into our justice system, only this time cloaked in the language of reversibility. And what reversibility? Let me part with this thought. Imagine that in the 99th year of a sentence, irrefutable evidence of innocence comes out. You awaken the sleeper into an alien world. Their parents, lovers, friends, children, all dead for generations. Every anchor to the world gone. But memories remain. The half-life they have lived remains. They can't escape from that. They can't start over. They will live as ghosts, a part of their lives in 1 century and a part in another, 2 broken halves. And this is not reversible. What do you expect will happen then to the half-life that remains, other than decay? And if we denied ourselves the right to kill in the name of justice, what right do we have to snap and weld and solder broken bits of life in the name of justice? I have attempted to persuade my colleagues to this point of view. I have failed. With due deference to the tradition of consensus at the court, I exercise my prerogative to dissent. I believe that today we have once again arrogated to ourselves the crown of infallibility that we had set aside 25 years ago. It's a burden that will one day haunt us. That's the excerpt.
That was beautiful, Gautam. I've argued numerous condition of delays, but I've never heard the concept and the doctrine of limitation being put so well.